December 16th, 1944. If one quiet intelligence officer hadn't defied conventional wisdom and warned General George Smith Patton about the impossible, 50,000 United States soldiers would have been annihilated in the snow-covered forests of Belgium. Not captured, not pushed back, annihilated. The largest German offensive in the West was about to explode across the front lines, and almost nobody saw it coming, except one man, a man who sat in the corner of war rooms, who never raised his voice, who studied maps while others talked strategy. His name was Colonel Oscar Koch, and he was about to save the life of the man they called Old Blood and Guts, and tens of thousands of American soldiers with him. This is the story of how the quietest man in the United States Army stopped the loudest general from walking into a death trap. This is what happened next. Picture this. Late November 1944. Somewhere in eastern France, in a temporary headquarters that smelled of cigarette smoke and wet wool, General George Smith Patton stood over a map table like a predator, studying prey. At 59 years old, Old Blood and Guts was everything a warrior should be. Lean, aggressive, impatient with anything that slowed his advance. His pearl-handled pistols gleamed at his sides. His voice cracked like a whip when he spoke. And right now, George Smith Patton wanted one thing: to smash through the German border and end this war by Christmas. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from behind comfortable desks. The nickname came from his soldiers, who watched him drive forward under fire, who saw him stand in his jeep during artillery barrages, who heard him curse at cowardice and praise bravery in the same breath. He had raced across Sicily in the summer of 1943, covering 200 miles in just 38 days. He had broken out of Normandy after D-Day, exploiting the gap at Avranches and unleashing his Third Army across France like a steel flood. His columns had liberated more French territory in 3 months than anyone thought possible. The newspapers loved him. Soldiers feared and worshipped him in equal measure. And the Germans? They considered George Smith Patton the most dangerous man in Europe. Around the map table, staff officers shuffled papers and nodded at every word Old Blood and Guts spoke. Forward, always forward. The mood was electric with confidence. Germany was beaten, everyone said. Hitler was out of fuel, out of men, out of time. The war was practically over. Just one more push and the Third Army would be across the Rhine, driving into the heart of the Reich. Berlin by spring, victory by Easter. The end was in sight. But in the corner of that room sat a man who did not share the optimism. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence chief, was hunched over a smaller desk covered with prisoner interrogation transcripts, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and radio intercept summaries. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a professor rather than a combat officer. His uniform was always neat, but never flashy. His voice was calm, measured, almost academic. Where George Smith Patton was thunder and lightning, Koch was the still air before a storm. Where Old Blood and Guts commanded attention by presence alone, Koch earned respect through accuracy. Through the painstaking work of assembling fragments of information into pictures nobody else could see. And right now, looking at the evidence spread before him like pieces of a deadly puzzle, Oscar Koch saw something that terrified him. The Germans were not collapsing. They were not surrendering. They were not running out of fight. Instead, they were regrouping. They were massing armor, infantry, and artillery opposite a thinly defended section of the Allied line, a forested, hilly region called the Ardennes Forest. The same ground where the Germans had launched their lightning invasion of France in May 1940, and they were preparing to do it again. Koch had been studying intelligence reports for weeks, watching patterns emerge like shapes in fog. Prisoner interrogations mentioned new divisions arriving at the front, divisions that, according to official order of battle estimates, should not exist or should be hundreds of miles away defending the Rhine or fighting the Soviets in the east. Aerial reconnaissance showed trains moving west into staging areas near the German border, not east toward the interior, as you would expect, from a defeated army consolidating its defenses. Radio intercept teams reported increased German signals traffic in sectors that had been quiet for weeks, the kind of chatter that suggested major units repositioning. And logistics reports, those dry, boring documents that most officers skipped over, hinted at fuel and ammunition dumps being established in the forest opposite the Ardennes. Koch pulled out his grease pencil and began marking his map. Here, a panzer division identified by prisoners. There, a Volksgrenadier division mentioned in captured documents. Another location, fuel dumps spotted by reconnaissance aircraft. Supply depots, troop concentrations, bridge repairs. Each mark on its own could be explained away. But together, they formed a pattern that Oscar Koch had seen before. The pattern of an army preparing to attack. He looked at the calendar. Mid-November. Winter was coming. Snow, fog, weather that would ground Allied aircraft and give the Germans cover from the overwhelming air superiority that had been pounding them since D-Day. And the Ardennes sector? It was defended by tired, understrength United States divisions that had been pulled back from brutal fighting in places like the Hurtgen Forest to rest and refit. Green units fresh from the States were filling gaps in the line. It was the quietest, least reinforced sector of the entire Western Front. To Oscar Koch, the pieces fit together with terrifying clarity. The Germans were not finished. Hitler was preparing one last desperate gamble, a winter offensive through the Ardennes, aimed at splitting the Allied armies, recapturing Antwerp, cutting off supply lines, and perhaps, if the dice rolled perfectly, forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. Koch cleared his throat and stood. The room fell quiet. General George Smith Patton looked up from his maps, those sharp eyes focusing instantly on his intelligence officer. In that moment, Koch knew that what he was about to say would sound to almost everyone in the room like paranoia, like the nervous worry of an intelligence officer who saw threats in every shadow. But he also knew that George Smith Patton, old blood and guts himself, would listen, because that was why they worked so well together. Patton trusted Koch to tell him the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Koch spoke carefully, calmly, without drama. "Sir, I believe the Germans are preparing a major counteroffensive, possibly through the Ardennes, soon. Within weeks, maybe days." Silence. Then someone laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound quickly stifled. Another officer shook his head and glanced at his colleagues. The idea was absurd. Germany was finished. Everyone knew it. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had said so in their intelligence summaries. British intelligence had said so. The Germans lacked fuel, lacked reserves, lacked everything needed for a large-scale winter offensive through difficult terrain against the United States Army. The very idea was fantasy, intelligence officer paranoia, but George Smith Patton did not laugh. Old blood and guts did not dismiss his intelligence officer with a wave of his hand or a crude joke. Instead, he leaned forward over the map, his hands flat on the paper, and asked a single question. "Show me." Over the next 3 days, from late November into early December 1944, Oscar Koch laid out his case like a prosecutor, building an argument for a jury that desperately did not want to convict. He brought General George Smith Patton into his cramped intelligence section and walked him through every piece of evidence, every fragment of information that had accumulated over the previous weeks. He showed old blood and guts the prisoner interrogation reports. A captured German sergeant from the 12th SS Panzer Division mentioned that his unit had been pulled off the line and moved to a rest area for refitting. But when interrogators pressed him, he mentioned seeing Tiger tanks, heavy armor, being transported west by rail. Another prisoner, a junior officer from a Volksgrenadier division, let slip that his regiment had received new winter uniforms and extra ammunition, far more than would be needed for defensive operations. Koch showed George Smith Patton the aerial reconnaissance photographs. Here, a rail yard that had been empty 2 weeks ago was now packed with freight cars. There, a forest road that had been unused was suddenly showing vehicle traffic marks in the mud. Supply dumps covered with camouflage netting, fuel tankers parked under trees, bridge repairs on routes leading toward the Ardennes. None of it made sense if Germany was simply collapsing in defeat. He showed the radio intercept logs. German signals traffic had increased dramatically in certain sectors, while remaining quiet in others. Traffic analysis experts noted that entire headquarters units had gone radio silent, which usually meant they were moving. And when units moved secretly, they were moving into attack positions, not retreat. Koch pulled out logistics reports, the kind of dry, technical documents that made most officers' eyes glaze over. But to an intelligence analyst, logistics told the truth better than any prisoner or photo. The Germans were stockpiling fuel opposite the Ardennes. They were building ammunition dumps. They were repairing roads and railroads that led west, not east. An army retreating into Germany to defend the homeland would be moving supplies east toward the Rhine and beyond. An army preparing to attack would be doing exactly what Oscar Koch was seeing. General George Smith Patton listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not rush. He asked hard questions. How sure was Koch? What was the quality of the intelligence sources? Could this be deception, an elaborate German plan to make the Allies think they were stronger than they really were? What about Supreme Headquarters' assessment that Germany lacked the capability for offensive operations? Koch answered each question honestly, without exaggeration. He could not be absolutely certain. Intelligence was never certain. War was fog and friction and incomplete information. But the capability was there. Germany still had reserves. Hitler could pull divisions from the Eastern Front or create new units from training depots and rear area troops. The terrain of the Ardennes favored the attacker, narrow roads through forests that would channel Allied reinforcements and make counterattacks difficult. The weather forecasts predicted fog, snow, and low clouds that would ground the Allied air forces, removing the advantage that had been devastating German forces since Normandy. And most critically, the sector opposite the Ardennes was the weakest point in the entire Allied line. It was defended by 4 United States divisions stretched across 80 miles of front. 2 of those divisions, the 99th and the 106th Infantry Divisions, were fresh from the States, seeing combat for the first time. The other 2, the 4th Infantry and 28th Infantry Divisions, had been pulled back from the nightmare fighting in the Hürtgen Forest and were severely understrength, resting and absorbing replacements. If the Germans were going to attack anywhere, this was where they would do it. Old Blood and Guts stared at the map for a long time, his jaw working as he thought through the implications. Then he looked up at Oscar Koch and said something that would define their partnership and save thousands of lives. "I believe you," George Smith Patton called in his chief of staff. Brigadier General Hobart Gay. He called in his operations officer, his logistics officer, his artillery commander. He told them to prepare contingency plans immediately. If the Germans attacked through the Ardennes, when they attacked, he corrected himself, Third Army would disengage from its current eastward offensive, pivot 90 degrees north, and hit the German southern flank with overwhelming force. Not in a week, not in 5 days, in 72 hours if necessary. The staff officers stared at George Smith Patton as if he had ordered them to sprout wings and fly to Berlin. Turn an entire field army, 3 full corps, over 250,000 men, thousands of tanks and vehicles, tens of thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition and supplies, 90 degrees in the middle of winter on roads covered with ice and snow. Launch a coordinated offensive into the flank of what would presumably be a massive German attack, based on the assessment of one intelligence officer and the possibility, not certainty, possibility, of an attack that Supreme Headquarters said was impossible. But Old Blood and Guts was not asking for opinions or debate. His tone left no room for argument, no space for doubt. "Draw up the plans. I want 3 separate attack plans prepared. 1 for an attack toward Arlon and Luxembourg, 1 toward Bastogne, 1 toward Diekirch. Calculate fuel requirements for each. Identify assembly areas. Determine which divisions move first, second, third. Prepare orders for 3 divisions to be ready to move on 6 hours' notice. If Koch is right and we're not ready, American soldiers die. If he's wrong and we prepared for nothing, we lose some sleep and planning time. I'll take that trade every day of the week." The room was silent. Then slowly the staff began to move. They pulled out maps. They began drafting movement tables. They calculated fuel consumption rates and supply requirements. They identified which roads could handle heavy traffic and which would need engineer support. They worked through problems that seemed impossible. How do you move an entire army 90 degrees in winter when the enemy might be attacking you at the same time? And so, while the rest of the Allied command structure dismissed the possibility of a German offensive, while generals in Paris and London and Brussels made plans for Christmas parties and discussed post-war occupation zones. The Third Army staff worked through cold November and early December nights, drafting movement orders that everyone assumed would never be used. They calculated march routes. They pre-positioned fuel dumps along roads leading north. They identified which units would move first, second, third. They drew arrows on maps pointing north instead of east, toward Belgium instead of Germany. Most of them thought this was just another example of George Smith Patton's aggressive paranoia. Old blood and guts always wanted to be ready to attack. He believed that speed and violence of action won battles. He had written articles before the war about mobile warfare and rapid maneuver. This seemed like just another manifestation of his philosophy. Always be ready to strike, always be ready to move faster than the enemy can react. But the plans were ready. The orders were drafted. Movement tables were typed and distributed to subordinate commands with instructions to keep them sealed unless specifically ordered otherwise. Fuel was stockpiled, ammunition was redistributed, and the clock ticked toward December 16, 1944. Oscar Koch spent those weeks watching intelligence reports with the intensity of a man who had bet his reputation and potentially thousands of lives on an outcome he could not control. Every day that passed without a German attack, he wondered if he had been wrong. If he had led General George Smith Patton into wasting valuable planning time and resources on a phantom threat. If he had cried wolf and damaged his credibility for nothing. But every day, more small pieces of evidence arrived on his desk. Another division identified. Another supply dump spotted by aerial reconnaissance. Another radio intercept decoded by signals intelligence teams. The picture did not fade. It grew sharper. And Oscar Koch knew with increasing certainty that the storm was coming. He just did not know exactly when it would break. On December 15th, 1944, Koch drafted his final intelligence estimate before the attack. In careful, measured language, he stated his assessment. The enemy is capable of a major counteroffensive in the near future, most likely in the Ardennes sector. Capabilities include 10 to 15 divisions, including armor. Weather conditions favor such an operation within the next 48 to 72 hours. He handed the report to George Smith Patton. Old blood and guts read it, looked at his intelligence officer and said quietly, "Get some sleep, Oscar. Tomorrow might be a long day." And then, in the frozen darkness before dawn on December 16th, 1944, the storm broke. The German artillery barrage began at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944. 1,400 guns opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. Thousands upon thousands of shells fell on United States positions in the Ardennes forest. In the darkness and fog, American soldiers were blasted from sleep into chaos. Foxholes collapsed. Command posts were hit. Communications lines were severed by the bombardment. And then, out of the forest, came the German infantry. Entire divisions surged forward through the snow and fog. Volksgrenadier units attacked first. Overwhelm forward observation posts and probe for weak points. Behind them came the armor, panzers, panthers, tigers, assault guns, rolling forward with infantry clinging to their hulls. German paratroopers dropped behind American lines to seize bridges and road junctions. Special Forces units dressed in United States uniforms spread confusion and cut telephone wires. The 99th Infantry Division, in combat for only a few days, was hit by 3 German divisions at once. The 106th Infantry Division, which had arrived in the sector just 5 days earlier, found itself surrounded in a matter of hours. The 28th Infantry Division, still recovering from its mauling in the Hurtgen Forest, was pushed back from its positions. Entire battalions were overrun. Companies were surrounded and cut off. Radio nets went silent. Panic spread. By midday on December 16th, fragmentary and confused reports began flooding into Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Paris. Major German attack. Multiple breakthrough points. American units falling back or surrounded. Communications disrupted, but the scale was unclear. Was this a limited spoiling attack, a raid to disrupt Allied preparations for offensive operations? Or was it something bigger? By nightfall, the truth became horrifyingly clear. This was not a raid. This was a full-scale offensive. The the largest German attack in the West since the invasion of France in 1940. Entire American regiments were surrounded. German armored spearheads were driving west toward the Meuse River, toward Antwerp, toward the vital supply lines that kept the Allied armies fed and fueled. And the weather was terrible. Fog, snow, clouds so low that Allied aircraft sat grounded on their runways, unable to provide the air support that had been devastating German forces for months. At Supreme Headquarters, the shock was profound. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, received the reports with disbelief that quickly turned to cold determination. This was not supposed to happen. Intelligence estimates had said Germany lacked the capability for major offensive operations. But here it was happening in real time, and it had to be stopped. At 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, France, when the first fragmentary reports arrived in the early morning hours of December 16th, General George Smith Patton was already awake. He read the initial contact reports as they came in: German artillery, German infantry attacking in strength, communications disrupted. He walked into his intelligence section and looked across the room at Oscar Koch. There was no triumph in that look. No, "I told you so." No vindication or satisfaction. Only grim recognition and instant decision. Old Blood and Guts looked at the man who had warned him this was coming and said simply, "You were right. Now let's go kill them." George Smith Patton turned to his operations officer. "Issue the contingency orders. We're going north. Get Gay on the phone. Start moving fuel forward. I want Corps commanders briefed within the hour." The staff, which had been drilling these exact movements for 2 weeks, snapped into action. Orders that had been drafted and sealed were opened and transmitted. Unit commanders who had been told to prepare for a potential change in mission suddenly found that preparation becoming reality. Within hours, General George Smith Patton was on the telephone with Supreme Commander Eisenhower. He offered to disengage 3rd Army from its current operations along the Saar River and strike north into the southern flank of the German offensive. Eisenhower, still processing the shock of the attack and trying to coordinate a response across multiple armies, asked the question everyone was thinking: how soon can you move? When can you attack? George Smith Patton's answer became one of the most famous moments in military history. His voice crackling over the field telephone line, Old Blood and Guts said, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. I can have 6 divisions attacking within 72 hours. Give me the word and 3rd Army will pivot north and hit them so hard they'll wish they'd never left the Siegfried Line." There was silence on the other end. Eisenhower knew armies. He had commanded at every level from battalion to army group. He knew logistics, knew coordination, knew the complexity of modern military operations. What George Smith Patton was proposing was supposed to be impossible. You could not turn an entire field army 90 degrees and launch a coordinated offensive in 2 days. Not in peacetime on training grounds, certainly not in winter, not in combat, not on icy roads with an enemy attacking you at the same time. But Eisenhower also knew George Smith Patton. He had known him since before the war. He knew Old Blood and Guts was brilliant, difficult, profane, and utterly fearless. He knew that if any man in the United States Army could do the impossible, it was the lean, hard-driving general on the other end of the telephone line. And right now, with the German offensive tearing a hole in the Allied lines, Eisenhower needed someone who could do the impossible. "Do it," Eisenhower said. "Get there as fast as you can. Hit them as hard as you can. I'm counting on you, George." Patton hung up the phone and turned to his staff. "Gentlemen, we have our orders. 3rd Army is going to war, and we're going to show the Germans and everyone else what American soldiers can do when properly led. Let's move." What followed over the next 72 hours was one of the greatest displays of military movement and command in the history of modern warfare. While chaos reigned in the Ardennes, while German panzers drove west toward the Meuse River and key objectives, while American units fought desperate holding actions in towns whose names would become legendary: St. Vith, Bastogne, Uffalise, Malmedy, the 3rd Army transformed itself from an eastward attacking force into a northward striking hammer. Imagine you are a soldier in the 4th Armored Division, one of Patton's most experienced units. You have been fighting continuously since the breakout from Normandy in July. You have seen combat in France through the autumn mud and rain. You have lost friends. You are exhausted to the bone. Your division was pulled back from the Saar, fighting for what you were told would be a few days of rest. Hot food, showers, maybe mail from home, maybe some sleep in a building instead of a frozen foxhole. Then, in the middle of the night on December 19th, 1944, your company commander shakes you awake. "Get your gear, we're moving out, now." No explanation, no details, just orders. You crawl out of your sleeping bag, put on boots that are still damp from yesterday, grab your rifle and pack, and stumble out into the freezing darkness. Outside, the scene is controlled chaos. Vehicles are starting up, engines coughing and sputtering in the cold. Tank crews are performing hasty maintenance checks by flashlight. Supply trucks are being loaded. Officers are shouting orders over the noise. And you realize this is not a local movement. This is the entire division mobilizing. You climb into the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck, one of dozens lined up in convoy. The canvas cover does little against the freezing wind that cuts through your uniform. Your breath fogs in air so cold it burns your lungs. Around you, other soldiers huddle for warmth, stamping their feet, blowing on their hands. Nobody knows where you are going or why. You only know that somewhere north, something big is happening. And you know that when General George Smith Patton, old blood and guts himself, orders his army to move, you move fast. The convoy begins to roll. Headlights are blacked out because German aircraft might be overhead, though the weather is too bad for flying. You navigate by following the dim cat-eye lights on the vehicle ahead. The roads are narrow, winding through French and Belgian countryside, and they are covered with ice and snow. Drivers push their vehicles to the absolute limit. Tanks slide on icy hills, their tracks struggling for purchase. Supply trucks fishtail around curves. Vehicles break down and are immediately pushed off the road to let the column pass. Military police stand at intersections directing traffic, keeping the flow moving north. Engineers work frantically to reinforce bridges that were never designed to handle this volume of heavy traffic. Medics set up aid stations along the route to treat frostbite and cold injuries. Soldiers huddle together in truck beds and tank compartments, sharing body heat, trying to stay warm enough to function. Nobody sleeps, nobody complains. You ride through the darkness, through the day, through the next night. Meals are cold rations eaten on the move. Rest is measured in minutes, not hours. And still, the column pushes north. George Smith Patton was everywhere during those 3 days. He drove up and down the columns in his Jeep, accompanied only by his driver and aide. He stopped to shout encouragement at frozen soldiers. He cursed at traffic jams and personally redirected convoys when roads became blocked. He visited division command posts and demanded updates. He checked fuel supplies and ordered logistics officers to strip every depot to keep the advance moving. Old blood and guts slept perhaps 4 hours total between December 16th and December 22nd. He ate cold rations standing beside his Jeep or leaning over maps in his command post. His staff begged him to rest, to let subordinates handle the details. He ignored them completely. This was why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Not because he spent soldiers' lives carelessly, though his critics accused him of that, but because he drove himself harder than he drove anyone else. Because he led from the front. Because when he ordered men into danger, he went with them. Behind the scenes, Oscar Koch continued his quiet, essential work. He tracked German movements, identified which enemy units were committed to the offensive and which were still in reserve. He provided George Smith Patton with targeting information for the coming attack, telling him where German supply lines were vulnerable, where headquarters units were located, where the flanks were weakest. While Old Blood and Guts was the sword driving north, Koch was the eyes that told the sword where to strike for maximum effect. The movement statistics were staggering. In 72 hours, 3rd Army moved over 133,000 vehicles north through winter weather on inadequate roads. The 4th Armored Division covered over 100 miles. The 26th Infantry Division moved similar distances. The 80th Infantry Division redeployed and attacked north. Fuel consumption exceeded every estimate. And logistics officers performed miracles to keep tanks and trucks supplied. Engineers built bridges, cleared roads, and kept the arteries of movement open. By December 22, 1944, just 6 days after the German offensive began, 3 full divisions of 3rd Army were in position south of the German Bulge and ready to attack. Military analysts studying the operation decades later would call it one of the fastest, most complex large-scale movements in the history of warfare. Soviet generals, reviewing the operation after the war, expressed frank disbelief that it had been accomplished so quickly. British military historians wrote that it demonstrated American logistical excellence and command flexibility. But to George Smith Patton, it was just what United States soldiers did when properly led and given clear orders. On the morning of December 22nd, he stood at his forward command post, looked at the map showing his divisions arrayed for attack, and issued the order that would become legendary: drive like hell. 3rd Army attacked north toward the surrounded town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was holding out against overwhelming German forces. Old blood and guts was coming, and nothing, not weather, not terrain, not enemy resistance, was going to stop him. The fighting was absolutely brutal. German units, surprised by the speed of Patton's arrival, tried desperately to shift forces south to block 3rd Army's advance. They failed. George Smith Patton's tanks smashed through roadblocks like they were made of paper. His infantry assaulted German defensive positions with grenades and bayonets. His artillery fired every shell in every depot to make up for the lack of air support, pounding German positions until the ground shook. The 4th Armored Division led the drive toward Bastogne. Its commander, Major General Hugh Gaffey, embodied the Patton doctrine of aggressive, relentless attack. When his lead units ran into German resistance, they did not stop to consolidate or wait for reinforcements. They attacked through. When roadblocks appeared, tanks rolled over them. When German infantry tried to slow the advance, they were bypassed and left for following units to deal with. On December 23rd, the weather began to clear. Allied aircraft took to the skies in massive numbers, pounding German positions, supply lines, and reinforcements. The combination of air power from above and Patton's armor from the south created a killing zone. German units that had been advancing confidently west suddenly found themselves fighting for survival. German commanders, reading intelligence reports about 3rd Army's movement, could not believe what they were seeing. One captured German division commander would later tell interrogators, "We knew General Patton was good. We knew he was aggressive. But we did not know he was this good. He did in 3 days what should have taken 2 weeks. It should have been impossible, and yet he did it." Another German officer, a colonel captured near Bastogne, was more blunt. "When we heard 3rd Army was coming, we knew the offensive was finished. Patton does not defend. He attacks. And when he attacks, he does not stop." On December 26th, 1944, 10 days after the German offensive began, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion broke through to Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the battalion, radioed back the message that General George Smith Patton was waiting to hear. Contact established with 101st Airborne, Bastogne relieved. The moment when the first Sherman tanks rolled into Bastogne has become the stuff of legend in countless films. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, who had been fighting in frozen foxholes for 10 days with dwindling ammunition and supplies, who had been surrounded and outnumbered, who had replied nuts when the Germans demanded their surrender, emerged to see American armor flying 3rd Army's colors. Grown men wept openly. Officers embraced. Wounded soldiers who had been lying in makeshift aid stations cheered despite their pain. And the message went back down the column, through division headquarters, through corps headquarters, all the way to 3rd Army Command Post, to General George Smith Patton. Bastogne relieved, mission accomplished. Old blood and guts, standing beside his command vehicle when the news arrived, allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. His staff erupted in cheers, but George Smith Patton simply nodded, looked at the map showing German units still trapped in the Bulge, and said, "Good, now let's finish them." Relieving Bastogne was a triumph. It made headlines across the United States. It boosted morale throughout the Allied forces. It demonstrated that the German offensive, while shocking and initially successful, could be stopped and rolled back. But to General George Smith Patton, to old blood and guts, it was not the end of the operation. It was the beginning of destroying the entire German offensive. Over the following weeks, from late December 1944 through January 1945, 3rd Army pressed north and east from Bastogne, widening the corridor to the surrounded town, engaging and systematically destroying German units that were now trapped in the Bulge with their supply lines stretched dangerously thin and vulnerable to constant Allied air attack. The weather cleared completely after Christmas, and the full weight of Allied air power fell on the German forces. Thousands of sorties pounded German columns, supply trucks, fuel depots, and headquarters. Jabos, fighter bombers, strafed anything that moved. Heavy bombers attacked rail yards and bridges deep in Germany to prevent reinforcements from reaching the front. And Third Army, supported by artillery and airstrikes, ground forward relentlessly. George Smith Patton drove his divisions forward with the same intensity he had shown during the relief operation. When subordinate commanders reported enemy resistance, his response was always the same. Attack, find the weak spot and attack through it. Don't stop. Don't give them time to recover. Keep moving. Old Blood and Guts believed that the enemy was most vulnerable when he was confused and off balance. And the way to keep him confused was never to stop attacking. The fighting was savage. Villages changed hands multiple times. German units, despite being surrounded and pounded from the air, fought with desperate courage. They knew they were trapped. They knew the offensive had failed, but they were professional soldiers, and they fought to buy time for their comrades to escape. American infantrymen had to clear forests and towns, house by house, room by room. Tank battles raged in snow-covered fields. Artillery duels shook the ground day and night. But the outcome was never in doubt. The German offensive, which at its peak on December 24th, had created a bulge 50 miles deep and 60 miles wide into Allied lines, began to collapse under pressure from multiple directions. British and United States forces attacked from the north. Third Army attacked from the south. Other United States units attacked from the west. The bulge was being squeezed from three sides. What had Hitler intended as a decisive blow to split the Allied armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and perhaps force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace became instead a massive trap. German units that had advanced boldly west in mid-December now found themselves surrounded, cut off, pounded by artillery and airstrikes when the weather cleared. They had lost their mobility. Their tanks ran out of fuel. Their supply columns were destroyed from the air. And they were being ground to pieces by American soldiers who were angry, determined, and led by commanders who knew how to win. By mid-January 1945, the Bulge was completely erased. The front line was restored to roughly where it had been on December 15th, before the offensive began. But the cost to Germany was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht had lost tanks, assault guns, aircraft, trucks, and trained soldiers they could never replace. Hitler had gambled everything on one last desperate throw of the dice, and he had lost. Historians would later calculate the casualties. The United States Army suffered approximately 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded or injured, and 23,000 missing or captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Total Allied casualties approached 80,000. It was the bloodiest single battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. The losses were staggering, but they could have been catastrophic if Third Army had not been prepared. If General George Smith Patton had not believed Oscar Koch's warning weeks before the attack, if Old Blood and Guts had been caught facing east when the German storm hit, with no contingency plans and no ability to respond quickly, tens of thousands more American soldiers would have died in the forests of Belgium. Entire divisions might have been annihilated. The war might have been prolonged by months. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his after-action report submitted in February 1945, wrote, "The speed with which General Patton's Third Army reoriented itself and attacked north into the southern flank of the German salient was remarkable, possibly unprecedented in the annals of modern warfare. It demonstrated staff planning excellence, logistical flexibility, and aggressive leadership of the highest order. Third Army's performance was instrumental in halting and reversing the enemy offensive. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who commanded Allied forces on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, and who was rarely generous with praise for American commanders, admitted in his own report, General Patton's movement to Bastogne was a masterpiece of military logistics and command decision. Third Army's attack relieved pressure on forces in the north and contributed significantly to the defeat of the German offensive. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, reading translated reports of the operation months later, reportedly told his staff, "This Patton understands mobile warfare. He thinks like we do. Attack, always attack." But George Smith Patton knew the deeper truth. Yes, his leadership had been crucial. Yes, his aggressive philosophy and relentless drive had pushed Third Army to accomplish what others thought impossible. But none of it would have mattered if he had been caught unprepared. None of it would have worked if he had not had 2 weeks to plan, to position supplies, to draft orders and brief subordinates. And he would not have had those 2 weeks if Oscar Koch had not warned him. In a quiet moment after the battle, in his headquarters in Luxembourg in late January 1945, General George Smith Patton called his intelligence officer into his private office. Old blood and guts looked at Oscar Koch, the quiet man who never sought glory, who never gave interviews, who simply did his job with meticulous professionalism. And Patton said, "Oscar, you saved this army. You were right, and I listened. And because of that, thousands of men are alive who would be dead. I want you to know that I know that." Koch, ever the professional, replied simply, "Sir, you listened. That's what saved us. A lot of commanders wouldn't have. A lot of commanders would have told me I was seeing ghosts. But you listened and you acted. That's what made the difference." The two men shook hands. And in that moment, the partnership between the loudest general in the United States Army and the quietest intelligence officer was cemented into legend. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge rippled through the remainder of the war, in ways both obvious and subtle. For Germany, the offensive was a catastrophe from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. Hitler had gambled his last significant reserves on a desperate attempt to change the course of the war. He had achieved surprise and initial success, but once the Allied response, particularly Third Army's rapid counterattack, blunted the offensive, German forces were ground down in a battle of attrition they could not win. The German officers captured during and after the Battle of the Bulge told United States Army interrogators something revealing about how the Wehrmacht viewed their opponents. They had expected resistance, of course. They had planned for Allied counterattacks. But they had not expected General George Smith Patton to arrive so fast, in such overwhelming force, with such devastating effect. One German division commander, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, stated in his interrogation, "We knew General Patton by reputation. We studied his operations in Sicily and France. We considered him the most dangerous Allied general, more dangerous even than Montgomery or Bradley. But what he did at Bastogne exceeded our worst fears. He moved an entire army over 100 miles in winter and attacked within days. We thought we had at least a week before Third Army could respond. He gave us 3 days. That speed destroyed our timetable and doomed the offensive." Another captured German officer, a panzer colonel, who had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, was even more direct. "In Russia, we feared the Soviet tank armies because they attacked in overwhelming numbers and never stopped. In France, we feared the Allied air forces because they could destroy any concentration of vehicles. But we feared General Patton most of all because he combined both. He attacked with massive force and never, ever stopped. Once Patton's Third Army hit our southern flank, we knew the offensive was finished. The only question was how many of us would escape alive." The respect, even fear, that German commanders expressed for George Smith Patton was not mere flattery or an attempt to excuse their defeat. It was genuine professional recognition. The German Army of World War II was perhaps the most professional military force of its era. German officers studied warfare systematically. They knew excellence when they saw it, and they saw it in old blood and guts. The United States press, which had always loved George Smith Patton for his colorful personality and aggressive tactics, elevated him to mythic status after the Battle of the Bulge. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine on January 8, 1945. The article inside calling him the Allies' ace in the hole and describing his relief of Bastogne as one of the epic military movements of all time. His face was in every newspaper. Newsreel footage of Third Army tanks rolling through Belgian towns played in movie theaters across America. Radio broadcasts featured soldiers who had been at Bastogne telling stories of how old blood and guts had personally driven forward under a fire, how he had cursed and prayed and willed his army through the snow. George Smith Patton became more than just a successful general. He became an American icon, a symbol of aggressive masculinity, of never backing down, of attacking when others would have defended. The pearl-handled pistols, the profane speeches, the fearless leadership. All of it was amplified in the press until Patton was less a man and more a legend. But what the public did not see, what did not make the headlines or the newsreels, was the quiet intelligence officer who had seen the storm coming. Oscar Koch returned to his desk at 3rd Army headquarters after Bastogne was relieved. He went back to reading reports, updating maps, tracking the shrinking red symbols that represented German units. He gave no interviews, he sought no recognition, he posed for no photographs, he simply did his job. Within the United States military's intelligence community, however, Koch's achievement became an immediate case study in how intelligence work should be conducted. Intelligence officers from other armies and corps headquarters visited 3rd Army to study Koch's methods. They wanted to know how he had seen what others missed, how he had put together fragments of information into an accurate picture of enemy intentions, how he had convinced his commander to act on an assessment that contradicted the institutional consensus. Koch explained his approach patiently to anyone who asked. He had not done anything magical or mysterious. He had simply done what intelligence officers were supposed to do. He had collected information from multiple sources: prisoners, aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, logistics analysis. He had assessed enemy capabilities rather than simply guessing at enemy intentions. He had recognized that what an enemy can do is often more important than what you think he will do. And most critically, he had been willing to deliver an uncomfortable assessment even when it contradicted what everyone wanted to hear. The broader failure of Allied intelligence before the Battle of the Bulge became a subject of intense study and criticism. Evidence of the German buildup had existed at multiple levels of command. Supreme Headquarters had information about German divisions moving west. British intelligence had intercepted German communications. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed supply dumps and troop concentrations, but the institutional analysis had dismissed these indicators because they did not fit the prevailing belief that Germany was defeated and incapable of major offensive operations. This was a classic example of confirmation bias, of seeing what you expect to see rather than what the evidence shows. Allied intelligence officers at Supreme Headquarters looked at the same information that Oscar Koch analyzed and concluded it showed nothing significant because they wanted to believe, that the war was almost over. Koch looked at the same information and saw an attack coming because he judged German capabilities objectively, rather than filtering evidence through wishful thinking. The tragedy, as Koch would reflect quietly in later years, was not that intelligence officers at higher headquarters failed to collect information. The information was there. The failure was in evaluation, in analysis, in the courage to challenge institutional consensus. And most critically, the failure was in command, in generals who did not want to hear uncomfortable assessments because those assessments disrupted comfortable plans. George Smith Patton was the exception. Old blood and guts listened to his intelligence officer even when that officer's assessment contradicted what everyone else believed. Patton acted on Koch's warning, even when it meant diverting time and resources to prepare for an attack that might never come. That willingness to listen, that command courage, saved thousands of lives. After the Battle of the Bulge was won and the front stabilized, 3rd Army continued its advance into Germany. George Smith Patton drove his divisions across the Rhine River in March 1945. 3rd Army liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp in April, confronting the full horror of Nazi atrocities. Patton pushed deep into Bavaria and Czechoslovakia as the war entered its final weeks. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. General George Smith Patton had led 3rd Army from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany in less than a year. Old blood and guts had proven himself one of the greatest combat commanders in United States military history. But George Smith Patton did not make it home. On December 9, 1945, just 7 months after the German surrender, he was seriously injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. Despite the best medical care, he developed complications. On December 21, 1945, exactly 1 year after he had broken through to Bastogne, General George Smith Patton died. He was 60 years old. He was buried in the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, in plot number 4, row 4, grave 35. His grave is marked with a simple white cross, identical to those of the thousands of soldiers who died under his command. He is buried among his men, which is exactly what Old Blood and Guts would have wanted. Oscar Koch continued to serve as Third Army's G2s through the end of the war and the initial occupation of Germany. He retired from the Army with the rank of Brigadier General. After retirement, he lived a quiet life, but he did not remain silent about what he had learned. In the late 1960s, he worked with journalist Robert Allen to write a book titled G2 Intelligence for Patton, published in 1971. In the book, Koch laid out his intelligence methods, his philosophy, and his detailed account of the weeks before the Battle of the Bulge. He was sometimes called Patton's Oracle in reviews, the man who saw the future when others were blind. But Koch rejected that characterization. He wrote in the book's introduction, "I was not a prophet. I was an intelligence officer doing what intelligence officers are trained to do, assess enemy capabilities based on evidence. The real story is not that I saw the attack coming. The real story is that General Patton listened when I warned him and acted when others would have dismissed the warning." Oscar Koch died in 1975 at the age of 78. He received military honors at his funeral, but he never achieved the public recognition that George Smith Patton did. His obituary in major newspapers was a few paragraphs. No films were made about his life. No monuments were erected in his honor. And yet, in the story of the Battle of the Bulge, these two men, the loudest general and the quietest intelligence officer, are forever inseparable. Patton's boldness and aggressive leadership meant nothing without Koch's foresight and accurate analysis. Koch's intelligence work meant nothing without a commander willing to trust it and act decisively. Together, they saved lives, thousands upon thousands of them. American soldiers who walked out of the Ardennes forest in January 1945, who came home after the war, who married and had children and built lives. They owed their survival to one general who listened to one intelligence officer when the entire rest of the military establishment said that officer was wrong. Today, nearly 80 years after the Battle of the Bulge, the story of General George Smith Patton and Oscar Koch remains relevant. It is taught at the United States Army War College as a case study in command relationships and intelligence analysis. It is studied at Fort Leavenworth in courses on military decision-making. Officers at every level of the United States military learn about how Third Army prepared for and responded to the German offensive. But the lesson of George Smith Patton and Oscar Koch extends far beyond military history. It is not just about tanks and maps and winter battles in European forests. It is about something deeper and more universal. It is about trust. It is about the moral courage required to speak an uncomfortable truth. And it is about the even greater courage required to listen to that truth and act on it when everyone around you says you are wrong. Think about this for a moment. How many disasters throughout history could have been prevented if someone in power had listened to a quiet voice saying, "Danger is coming"? How many companies have collapsed because executives ignored analysts who warned about financial problems? How many accidents have occurred because someone raised a safety concern and was dismissed? How many relationships have ended because one person tried to say, "We need to talk about this," and was not heard? The pattern repeats endlessly across every level of human activity. The person with the uncomfortable truth tries to warn others. The people in charge, comfortable in their assumptions and unwilling to confront unpleasant realities, dismiss the warning, and then the disaster strikes. And everyone asks, how did we not see this coming? When the truth is that someone did see it coming, but was not heard. George Smith Patton's greatest achievement may not have been racing across France or relieving Bastogne. It may have been the quiet moment when he looked at Oscar Koch's stack of intelligence reports and said, "I believe you. Let's prepare." That moment of trust, that willingness to act on an uncomfortable warning, saved tens of thousands of lives. And Oscar Koch's legacy is not in headlines or monuments. It is in every soldier who came home from the Ardennes forest. It is in every grandchild and great-grandchild of those soldiers. It is in the lives lived and families built, because one intelligence officer refused to tell his commander what he wanted to hear, and instead told him what he needed to know. That is the weight of responsibility in any position of trust. That is the cost of courage, both for the person who must speak and for the person who must listen. Now, Let me ask you a question. In your life, who is your Oscar Koch? Who is the person who sees what you do not want to see? Who tells you the uncomfortable truths? Who warns you when danger is approaching, even when that warning disrupts your comfortable plans? And are you George Smith Patton only when it feels good, only when the advice fits what you already wanted to do? Or are you willing to be old blood and guts in the hard moments when listening means stopping, changing direction, admitting that your comfortable assumptions might be wrong? Because this story, at its core, is not about World War II or tank battles or military operations. It is about every boardroom where an analyst tries to warn that the numbers do not add up. It is about every family where someone tries to say, "I think we have a problem." It is about every organization where a quiet voice tries to speak truth to power. The question is always the same: will anyone listen? Or will they wait until the disaster strikes and then ask how they did not see it coming? Wars are won or lost, depending on whether the loud person in the room listens to the quiet one. Businesses succeed or fail, based on whether leaders hear the uncomfortable truths. Lives are saved or lost, based on whether someone pays attention when a voice says, "Something is wrong." General George Smith Patton understood this. Old blood and guts, for all his bluster and profanity and aggressive personality, understood that a commander's job was not just to lead, but to listen. To find people he could trust, and then actually trust them, even when their advice was uncomfortable. That is why the story of Patton and Koch resonates decades later. That is why it is still taught and studied, not because of tactical details or operational maneuvers, but because it demonstrates a fundamental truth about leadership and responsibility. The greatest act of courage is not charging into battle. It is listening when someone tells you that your current course leads to disaster, and then having the strength to change course before it is too late. Thousands of men walked out of the Ardennes forest in January 1945 because one general listened to one intelligence officer. How many people in how many situations have suffered or died because the person in charge refused to believe the quiet voice saying danger is coming? This is not ancient history locked in dusty books. This is every moment when someone has information that could save lives, or futures, or organizations. And the question is whether anyone will listen before it is too late. George Smith Patton was a great general. He was brilliant, aggressive, fearless, and utterly committed to victory. They called him Old Blood and Guts, and he earned that name through years of leading from the front. But his greatest moment may have been the quietest, when he trusted a quiet man with intelligence reports and prepared for a disaster that everyone else said was impossible. And Oscar Koch's quiet legacy lives on in every intelligence officer who speaks truth to power, in every analyst who refuses to soften uncomfortable findings, in every person who has the courage to say, "I think we are wrong," when everyone else is comfortable with the current course. The legend of General George Smith Patton, Old Blood and Guts, lives on in military history, in films, in books, in the collective memory of what American soldiers can accomplish when properly led. His aggressive tactics and relentless drive are still studied and admired, but the lesson of Patton and Koch is what we should remember most. Listen to the quiet voices. Trust the people you have hired to tell you the truth. Act on uncomfortable warnings even when acting is difficult. And understand that the greatest disasters are often the ones someone tried to warn you about, but you were too comfortable, too certain, or too proud to hear. That is what happened in November and December 1944, in a small headquarters in France where one quiet intelligence officer warned one loud general about an impossible attack. And because that general listened, thousands of men lived who otherwise would have died. That is the weight of responsibility. That is the cost of courage. And that is the question this story leaves you with. When the quiet voice speaks in your life, will you listen? Or will you wait until the storm is already here and then ask how you did not see it coming? If this story of how Colonel Oscar Koch and General George Smith Patton, Old Blood and Guts himself, saved the United States Third Army, moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. We are bringing you more untold stories from World War II. More moments when courage and intelligence changed the course of history. More accounts of what American soldiers accomplished under leaders like George Smith Patton. Because the story of Old Blood and Guts is far from finished. There are battles we have not covered, moments of genius and controversy, the full complex truth about one of history's greatest combat commanders. and you need to hear what comes next. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because next week we are diving into the moment when George Smith Patton almost lost everything and what he did to save his career and win the war.